Right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second part of the Planning Committee meeting. A few housekeeping points. There's no fire drill scheduled, but given it's very hot weather, you never know with the Town Hall's ancient circuitry. So if fire does break out, the Democratic Services Officer will establish the safest way to exit the building and hopefully will let us know, and then we will follow her out. Personally, if I was the officer, I'd just keep going, but there you go. The meeting is being webcast this evening, but is there anyone else intending to record audibly or visually this meeting? I ask simply to know, not in order to stop anyone from so doing. No? That's fine, great. Right, we proceed onwards with the agenda. Item 1, apologies for absence. We have one from Councillor Prendergast. Anyone else? Councillor Bolton, thank you very much. A notification of substitute members. Councillor Butler for...
Councillor Mrs Prendergast.
Thank you. And Councillor Burton?
For Councillor Bolton.
That's confusing. Thank you. Item 3, notification of visiting members. Councillor Springett. I assume that's for item 10, 164 Ashford Road. Councillor Harvey. That's for item 11, land adjacent to Mews, Buckland Lane, correct? I don't see any others, although I believe Councillor Daly is... Oh, Councillor Perry, you're confusing things by sitting over there. You know by now you should sit over there.
Oh, I have my hand smacked. I forget it's the land...
Agenda item 12.
It's the pink blotchy fencing, if anybody knows it. I've got trousers to match, so that's fine.
Agenda item 12, page 50, land adjacent South Cottage. The beautiful scenic Harris fencing. Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. Can we agree that if he turns... Can we agree, members, that if Councillor Daly turns up, he will be allowed to speak? Right, thank you very much. Items withdrawn from the agenda. I'm not aware of any this evening. Item 5, any business the Chairman regards as urgent, including the urgent update reports. We do have urgent update reports, only a very small number. Can we take those this evening, members? Thank you very much. Item 6, disclosures by members and officers. Councillor Spooner.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I need to disclose that I may have prejudiced my consideration of item 10, which is 164 Ashford Road, because I had previously commented on this application in my capacity as the former chairman of the Bearsted and Furnham Society. I've now resigned that post since being elected a borough councillor. What I would suggest I might be able to do is to address the committee, because I do have issues I'd like to raise, and then I would leave the chamber and not take part in the debate or vote on that item.
Councillor Spooner.
Sorry.
Councillor Spooner, have you firmly determined previously whether you were in favour or against the application?
I was in favour of the application, but since that time, that was my view at that time, since then other things have happened, so I've now had a chance to reassess the representations that have been made and the additional evidence that's been put forward.
Well, it's up to the legal officer to advise you, but that doesn't sound like predetermination to me, because you've clearly changed your mind since, or...
I felt it necessary to declare that, in order to make sure what I ever said was proper.
Yeah. Well, unless the legal officer tells me I'm wrong, that doesn't sound like predetermination. I suggest you stay for the debate.
Okay.
Right. Any other disclosures? Right. I'll take disclosures of lobbying with the applications on the agenda. Item 8, to consider whether any item should be taken in private because of the possible disclosure of exempt information. There are none this evening that I am aware of, so we take everything in public. Be it noted that we're moving on to agenda item 9, Sutton, which is Sutton Valence. If Councillor Mrs Stockwell does arrive, we have started this item, so she will not be able to take part in this discussion. So, if you'd like to start the report.
Thank you, Chair. This is an application for the provision of 3 residential dwellings at Crossways, Maidstone Road, Sutton Valence. The application site is shown in red on the plan in front of you. This is at near the Warm Lake Crossroads. This is a few pictures of the existing situation, existing parking area, a tennis court referred to on the report is shown here, a view along Maidstone Road from both sides of the proposed entrance, access drive towards the road, view east of the garden and an existing house. A couple more shots and a larger block plan. The proposal is, as I say, for 3 houses. This has come down, as mentioned in section 3.1 of the report, from 4 following reconsultation. The houses are shown in elevation and plan form here, and again here 2-storey detached dwellings, and the site plan shown there with a single access off. The proposal is considered to fail to comply with policy ENV 28, but as the report points out, it is considered acceptable in terms of avoiding harm to the character and appearance of the area or amenities to the surrounding occupiers. So that issue is not considered to be significant. Other matters such as residential amenity are dealt with in sections 6.14 and 6.15. I would point out on the most recent urgent update, an additional condition is suggested to obscure the glazing of a proposed bathroom window mentioned in paragraph 6.14. So the officer had picked that up, but unfortunately the point wasn't carried through onto a condition, so I've added that. In terms of highways issues, the application is considered acceptable. Landscaping, ecology matters are dealt with in section 6.18, and in 6.21 the situation in terms of existing ecology is addressed, and future habitat appraisal is put forward to deal with those existing possible pockets of ecological interest. That's covered by a condition. In conclusion, the application is put forward for, recommended for approval subject to conditions.
Thank you very much. I just ask the legal officer, well, I would ask the legal officer, but he seems to be, oh, right, welcome back, to briefly outline the rules for public speaking this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is a short announcement for members of the public, and in particular those who are speaking on an item on the agenda this evening. As you've just heard, an item is announced by the Chairman, and then the Planning Officer introduces the item. The Chairman will then call the speakers. When you hear your name called, please come forward to the table in front of you and take a seat. To speak, press the middle button. You do not need to hold it down. The button will turn green, and the ring around the mouthpiece on the microphone will turn red. You will have 3 minutes to speak, and you'll see your time counting down on the screen in the corner behind me. At the end of 3 minutes, the Chairman will tell you your time is up. Once you finish speaking, please press the middle button. It will turn white and return to your seat. You may hear some of the speakers referred to as visiting members. They are members of the Council, but they don't sit on this committee. They also have 3 minutes to speak, but they have no right to vote on any of the applications. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much indeed. Can we make any declarations of lobbying at this point? Anyone lobbied? No? Good. Makes recording it very simple. Right, there is as the officer said, there is an urgent update on your papers relating to a condition which has already been explained. Right, we have just the one speaker on this application this evening, Councillor Stanicum of Sutton Valence Parish Council. If you'd like to come forward, sir, you have 3 minutes. Press the middle button.
Thank you. Good evening, Chairman and fellow members. Sutton Valence Parish Council strongly object to this increase in the housing that is taking place along the Warm Lake stretch. Maidstone Borough Council has its own housing numbers at present. This is in additional to that figure. The application is a back garden development and therefore in disagreement with Maidstone's own planning regulations. It is outside the defined settlement boundaries and adjacent to the open countryside in MBC policy MV28, as you've heard. The current building, Warm Lake, is predominantly low chalet-type bungalows, apart from the Oaks. These are 19th century housing farmhouses. The application with this and the Oaks already spoiling the actual character of the area. We just see that as intensifying the housing within that area. At present, we have 30 houses being built within a 1 kilometre area. This will now increase to 60 houses within this area. Regardless of comments from Kent Highways, I'm sure that members that travel up and down the 274 will realise that Warm Lake is a very dangerous black spot, and police are called there very often. In fact, there was an incident 2 weeks ago where a car was ploughed into the opposite fencing, causing a lot of damage. Any members that travel up there will have seen that. Regardless, there is no continuous footpath from Warm Lake to any of the amenities. This seems to be disregarded in every application that seems to go forward. To actually go to the post office, you would need to cross the road 3 times. It is that. The cars, obviously, it's an increase on the traffic. The neighbours within that area are finding it even difficult to get off the driveways because of the amount of traffic coming up the 274, and particularly at that pinch point at the Warm Lake crossing, which obviously increases the air pollution within that area. And in certain times of the morning, it is gridlocked. It's an area of the Sutton Valence Parish which is surrounded, or was surrounded, by farmland, which is now being completely...
I'm sorry, Councillor, that's 3 minutes.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Thank you very much. Right, we don't have the ward member here this evening, so I'll go straight forward to the normal discussion. Councillor Harwood, did you indicate there?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I think this committee has made clear its feelings about development at Warm Lake, but we've also paid the price for it to a certain extent because appeal inspectors are really not entertaining our reasons for refusal. Indeed, as you know, we had costs awarded against us for the site hard onto the crossroads. Because this site is essentially enclosed by the development plots which have been approved by inspectors, I think we'd really be on a hide into nothing in terms of an appeal situation. The other critical issue here is, for those who know the schemes which have have been given permission and are currently going up, you'll notice they don't have the kind of design benefits that we have forced. If you look at, they've got no renewables built into them. They've not got the niches for wildlife. The landscaping is not, I suggest, of a standard that we would normally expect. So I think reluctantly, I think the writing is on the wall in terms of any inspector's decision on this. And if we are to maintain some control, I think we need to grant permission but get a grip of it in terms of the conditions that are on the papers. One thing that I am concerned about is the hedge fronting the A274 is so important, but it's not a protected hedge. So what is to stop householders simply tearing it out to get more parking, to put more vehicles in, and then we do have a very urban gateway to Sutton Valence, which is, a genuinely rural Green Sandwich village with, in a fairly unsustainable location, it's got to be said, but we've used all the arguments with inspectors and they have not entertained them, as mentioned. So if I can have some satisfaction on how we can maintain the hedgerow boundary, and also I think we do need to tighten up a little bit on landscaping. I think with that, I think I'll have to move that we grant permission as per the papers. Thank you.
Can I ask Councillor Harwood that, because condition 10 does sort of refer to this, whether you're satisfied with that condition or do you think it needs beefing up in any way? Because that is the one that refers.
Yeah, indeed, but it's a landscape condition and it will remain in place for 5 years or whatever, but what's going to happen beyond that and what's to stop it if they come out? I mean, I wonder if we do need to consider a tree preservation order on the site frontage, so that if they do remove it, they will have to replace it.
I'll ask Mr Chapman to come back on those 2 points.
Okay. The condition 10 talks about the need to show existing trees, hedges and blocks of landscape and show whether they are to be retained and removed. An additional line can be added to that condition saying and those marked for retention shall be retained in perpetuity, subject to written consent from local planning authority should any change be requested.
And about TPO?
TPO, we can look at TPO, but that would be a separate matter, separate from this application.
You would probably want to add an informative referring to that. Any other conditions while you're at it? Just make sure we try and...
No, I think we've captured with standard conditions, but, I mean, as anyone knows who sees those developments going up, we have not got those conditions on those schemes that were permitted at appeal, and that, unfortunately, is the case time after time in this borough.
Councillor Round.
Are we on? Yes. Thank you, Chair. To some extent, Councillor Harwood has said what I wanted to say. But I would like to add on that I'm still very, very concerned about traffic and the crossroads itself, and also the fact that there is a bus stop the other side of Warm Lake, where, quite frankly, it has a significant effect. Yes. It has a very significant effect on the actual flows of traffic and the visibility at times on the crossroads. I think potentially we could have had some better advice from KCC in terms of traffic and transport issues on this one. But as is said by Councillor Harwood, it is important to get some right conditions in this respect. But may I ask that perhaps the bus stop can be looked at in a better way?
We can't really deal with the bus stop being in the wrong place as part of the application, but Councillor Round, if you wanted to ask our representative on the Quality Bus Partnership to raise this with Arriva and see if there's a possibility of moving the bus stop to a better location. Thank you. We have done that in a number of other places around the borough. if that would help. Right, we move on to Councillor Burton. I almost called you Borton.
Thank you, Chair. I hope that won't be too much of a confusion tonight. So my sentiments on this have been relatively well summed up already, but I think the point needs to be made as to why we take our time and our officers' time to develop certain policies. This application is clearly contrary to Safe Policy ENV 28 and Emerging Policy SP 17. Unfortunately, with similar applications, we've failed to get the support of inspectors when these things have gone to appeal. You do wonder why we try to come up with planning policies in the first place at times. So unfortunately, and with a heavy heart, I find myself in a position where I cannot vote to refuse this application because I will not willingly expose the council taxpayers in our borough to footing the bill for any more rewards of costs. I do also think that the point has been touched upon quite recently in my one short year of being a councillor and in my many appearances as a substitute member on this committee. There have been a great number of times where we have sat here and all said how we feel that some of our support from KCC Highways as a statutory consultee is sometimes lacking in support for things that we know on the ground in our borough to be dangerous and difficult. So they're two things that perhaps naively I hope to see changed in the future, but unfortunately I'm in a position where I cannot refuse this application.
Yes, I think you speak for a lot of us, Councillor Burton. I'm going to take the two speakers I have indicating, but because of where we are, I'm not going to take any more after that. Councillor Mumford.
I'll make this very quick. Again, we're trampling all over our SP17. 4 years it took us to write that. In the past, if it was outside of the village envelope, it contravened ENV 28. We controlled our countryside. We even use in our own policies here DM1, DM34, but the access to get to them would be through the strategic policy of 17, SP17. And we're even using our own policies against us. We might as well rewrite SP17 and say if no harm is caused to the countryside, any development can take place in the countryside. That's all I've got to say.
I wouldn't disagree with you, Councillor Mumford. Councillor Spooner, you get to sum up.
Is that working? Right. I have considerable sympathy for the views of the parish council. It must be very difficult when you see your local area changing out of all recognition, and I can appreciate how people get concerned and upset when these developments go forward. I've heard what the other speakers have said, and I understand about the policy basis, and planning applications shouldn't be made in conformity with the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. But in this particular instance, we've had a whole series of planning appeals where the planning inspectors have said something completely different. It is they who've driven a hole and coach and horses through our policies. I'm sure our policies have always been well-founded and well-argued and well-presented, but the inspectors have not agreed. And we now have a situation where we have what literally is an infill block. We have new housing pretty virtually all the way around it, and I think if we try to refuse it, I agree with Councillor Harwood, we will be on to a hiding for nothing. So let's grant the permission and get some stringent conditions and make sure they're rigidly enforced. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Spooner. Sorry, Councillor Clark, I miscounted. It was 6 people.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. My question is to the officers. We've had a number of applications here, as been mentioned, and they've gone to appeal and we've lost. When we were mindful to reject some of those applications, we were aware of the fact that there was a lack of 5-year housing supply, and even though many of the members of this committee felt that sites were unsustainable in their location, we were advised that given the lack of five-year housing supply, in the balance, the harm to the open countryside, etc., couldn't be considered. However, on a couple of occasions, we went against that advice from officers, went ahead and refused, and appeals have come back in the opposite direction to this committee's wishes. My question is, most of these appeal sites actually were applied for before we had our five-year housing supply. And we're now in a position where we've got an application coming forward in the same location that we've previously had concerns about, where we do have a five-year housing supply. Is it the officer's view that we just, even though at the time that was the rationale, because we didn't have, now even though we do, we still have to be bound by those conditions, even though the five-year housing supply has changed?
The appeals, obviously we've heard about the views on those decisions, and the appeals make it clear from the inspector's point of view that this is considered to be a sustainable location. So the issue of five-year land supply is not directly relevant to making that change in position. It's a sustainable location. That's been shown by those decisions, and I think we have to take that on board, and indeed the officer's report does that. The five-year land supply issue is... No.
As Mr Chapman said, that if the appeal had been based on a weighting of the landscape value against the five-year housing land supply, and we've had quite a few appeals like that which we've lost, a lot we've won as well. So if it had been based on that threshold test, then I think we could with some fair confidence actually refuse this application because of the very argument you're making. But unfortunately, in all the appeals that we've had in Warmlake, the inspector has just basically disagreed with the council's argument that this was an unsustainable location, and has said, I paraphrase and praise thee considerably, but has essentially said that they believe this to be a sustainable location. That's the problem. And the second problem is that although every single person in this room knows that's not a safe road, county highways say it is. And whilst third parties at appeals, as you know yourself, and an Orphalose Residents Association can choose to go to an appeal and make that argument, because if they lose, they won't be awarded costs for doing that, and occasionally are successful. If we as a public authority go to a planning appeal and argue a highways argument without the support of the highway authority, 99 times out of 100, well, maybe a bit less, 90 times out of 100, we will lose and get a cost award. So we have been well and truly, I think the technical point is shafted, but there isn't much we can really do about it other than try and get the conditions right, because as Councillor Harwood has said, the appeal inspectors tend not to attach many conditions. So anyway, I'm sorry I've spoken longer than I intended to on that. If anyone wants to move any further amendments or informatives, I'll entertain them. Otherwise, we shall move to a conclusion. Councillor Harwood, you've moved the recommendation on the papers and amended it with a change to the condition and an informative about seeking a tree preservation order. We made a separate note, although it's not part of the discussion, that we will approach the Quality Bus Partnership about the location of the bus stop. But that is a separate note and not part of this decision. But we will note it in the minute, if that's agreed. Yes, preserving the hedgerow along the front. Yes, thank you. Right, I will formally second the proposals. All those, however reluctantly, in favour? That's everyone. So obviously no one against or abstentions. I do apologise to the Parish Council for the limitations that we are labouring under here. Councillor Harwood.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I was waiting until we'd actually determined the application. But I think there is a policy issue here that SPST might need to look at, in that we've essentially had a new hamlet it's unplanned growth. This hamlet has now appeared, but all of the points we were talking about around public transport and so on had not been considered in the way that they would have done if this had been planned growth and not growth by appeal. And I do wonder whether we do not need to perhaps ask SPST or even to actually look at the issue, especially around public transport and access to services in relation to this part of northern Sutton Valence.
Well, I'll ask the Vice Chairman of SPST whether he will take that forward in his next agenda-setting meeting. Councillor Cox.
Certainly, yes, I will. If you want to brief me on any more of the detail you want to do that, I will bring it forward.
Thank you, Councillor. Right, we now move on to item 10, page 11, 164 Ashford Road, Bearsted.
Thank you, Chair. This is an application for a new dwelling, a replacement dwelling, the demolition of 164 Ashford Road, a replacement dwelling and the creation of alterations to an access road to access that dwelling and to serve 162A Ashford Road. The report details the main elements of the application and changes to it in terms of amendments. One major issue is the impact of the proposal upon landscaping and TPO trees, which is detailed within the description of the site in section 1 of the report and later on within the report and its analysis. I'll go on to that in a little more detail, but just to cover a few other issues. In terms of the highway impact, those are considered to be acceptable, and indeed the revised access is considered to be an improvement on the existing situation. The replacement house replaces, I'll just take you through a few photographs, replaces a currently derelict property which has been subject to vandalism, as shown here, and as the report and a previous urgent update appended to the report shows, has bats in it. The analysis goes on to summarise that there's considered to be no significant damage to visual amenity, no significant negative impact on residential amenity. There is a suggested, as I say, urgent update regarding the issue of bats, which would be addressed through the creation of space within a garage and integrated bat boxes and raised roof and ridge tiles. This is detailed on page 30 of the adjourned agenda. So I think moving on to the issue of TPO trees, a number of TPO trees suggested to be removed. The impact of the original proposal of the trees in this location, I'm pointing on the screen if you can see that, have been amended to move both the new dwelling and the proposed garage further away from those trees to safeguard the root protection areas of them. The arboricultural officer has commented on the loss of the TPO trees. This is detailed within the report and analysed in section 8.34 on page 24 and 25, and considered by that officer to be acceptable I understand that one tree in question, T8, detailed in 8.35 of the report, is actually, there is an opportunity to safeguard that tree, and no doubt we can discuss that as the debate continues, but that option is on the table. I think I'll pause there, but in conclusion, the application is considered acceptable and recommended for approval.
Thank you very much. Our first speaker this evening is Mr. Van der Spee, an objector. Please come forward, please. You press the middle buttons.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for the opportunity to address the committee. We have been citizens of Bearsted for the last 16 years, and part of the pride and privilege of living in Bearsted is living in that particular location that overlooks the woodland, which is on the property in question. Our concern was raised last year when the current new owner started demolishing part of the woodland indiscriminately, and indeed more than 40% of the woodland has already been so indiscriminately destroyed. Had that action not taken place, I probably wouldn't be here tonight. Bearsted is considered by us to be an area of absolute beauty, and our concern about this development is not against the replacement of the house, nor against the replacement of the tennis court. I've heard all of the cases for why would a tree preservation order be placed on a tree in the middle of the tennis court. That's not the objection. The objection is that the property, which I currently occupy and have been occupying for the last 16 years, adjacent to my neighbours, number 26, number 24, number 28, and number 30 of Bodgham Crescent, overlooks the woodland that I'm referring to, the same woodland that has now partially been destroyed. Had the opportunity existed tonight to register myself as a conditional objector, I would have done so. That option didn't exist. I'd like to make the case that conditional to the woodland being protected, we are not against the replacement of the dwelling, nor against the replacement of the tennis court. Our passion is to retain the woodland. Speaking to the points in the preamble, the loss of privacy that this would result if the woodland were to be destroyed, the loss of habitat for wildlife should the woodland further be destroyed, and lastly, the violation of the tree preservation order, which we successfully secured last year when we saw the diggers move in. I'll not speak to property value, as I see that's one of the excluded items. I will, however, speak to the extensive wildlife that is in that woodland. I'm not entirely sure how much time I have left. Pardon? Thank you. Thank you. Finally, the woodland is precious to us, and we would like to see it retained. We're not set against the dwelling. We're not set against the tennis court. I appeal to the council to allow the trees to be preserved, the trees which are currently, and I can't identify short of walking over to the screen, but you will identify that as being adjacent to properties number 24, 26, 28, and 30 Bodgham Crescent. I've canvassed my neighbours. They've asked me to ask one further question. Why the very broad, extensive access way? Why is that needed? Their consideration, and I've been asked to present their concern, is this potentially planning permission by stealth for further development downstream? Thank you for the opportunity to address you.
Thank you very much, sir. And I'm sorry about the confusion with the clock. I don't know quite what's happened there. We'll try and sort it out. Sadly, we can't give 15 minutes to everyone. Right, okay. Mr. Bedford, I think we've got it sorted out now, so if you'd like to give it a shot. These things happen.
Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to comment on this application. What I'd really like to do is just to respond to the key objections, so access and the issue of trees. So in terms of access, members may or may not be aware that the Best family, the key applicants, own the land immediately adjacent to the site. Agricultural land, which they've been able to do absolutely nothing with for the last, well, getting on for 30 years that they've owned it, purely because it's not wide enough to bring proper modern agricultural machinery or transporters down there. So when 174 became available on the market, the sole reason for them purchasing was really to try and provide a meaningful, safe access so they could make better use of the agricultural land. That involved collaborative working with the neighbours. There was a need to widen the frontage on Ashford Road in order to get the visibility. In return, land was to be gifted back to the existing neighbours so that they could have a safe and reasonable turning area without their property values being impacted. So there was a lot of collaboration that I think has come up with a fantastic new arrangement whereby 3 substandard highway accesses have been replaced by 3 modern accesses that meet safety requirements. Turning to matters of trees, the applicant has removed a significant amount of trees. I'm not going to gloss over that, but it's all about the context. We don't have the luxury available here, but if you were to look over Google Earth historic imagery, you would see that 20, 30 years ago, the majority of those trees weren't there. They are part of a domestic garden. They're not part of woodland. Sadly, the lady that lived up in the property until her death quite recently hadn't been in a position to maintain that garden for 20 to 30 years. And what the applicant did immediately upon purchase, and perhaps a little heavy-handedly, they went in and they cleared all that scrubland out. And they went in and they removed the more mature trees that were seen to be of risk of falling and could cause harm to health. That's the nature of what's been done here. There is not a proposal to remove significant mature trees. The applicant is very much open to working with the council on a robust landscaping scheme. New planting where necessary. The existing TPO, which was only served after the scrubland was removed, remains in force, so that prohibits any further removal of trees. And in all other respects, the application meets planning policy. The access is within the urban confines where the work's going to be carried out. It's very much typical of a location such as this. And the application is underpinned by a substantial amount of ecological, arboricultural and transport evidence that all went in and is available for public view. So I very respectfully request that you follow Officer's recommendation, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Bedford. Very nearly on time. Councillor Springett.
Thank you. Good evening, members. I've always understood they've had tractors in that field before they took the trees out, but perhaps that was a misinformation. First of all, I want to make it clear I have no objections to replacement dwelling at all, and I'm not asking members to refuse this application. What I am upset about is the amount of damage done to the woodland and the tree removal there. Those of you that may have seen these images that are on, I think, on the application site, can see the amount of trees that have actually been removed. And this is in the existing special landscape area and the emerging River Len local landscape value in the emerging local plan. The officer report refers to previous removal of trees along the boundaries with 162, 162A and 164 Ashford Road, and then briefly refers to together with other trees on the site, but this just totally fails to correctly record the damage that has been done in that woodland belt. It took several days before our tree officers could come out, and when they did come out, they did stop the works. The remaining trees are now protected by TPO, but this replaces no requirement to replace the many other mature trees that were felled. So my reason for being here is to ask you to consider expanding condition 6 to include the requirement to replace some of the trees that were removed to restore the woodland. The tree removal at the entrance area has opened up the site quite noticeably, And I think a wider access will be very noticeable because along that road, each individual house has a single width access with hedges and walls either side. So I think it will be quite noticeable. And I struggle with the need to make the entrance quite so wide because it's had a fire engine down there when the building was set on fire. Personally, I still strongly object to removal of the tree called T3 on the TPO, which is on the western boundary. I know the arboricultural officer hasn't objected because it's been badly pruned in the past, but it's still a big tree. It's quite significant on the skyline, and I think it has an amenity value. Just very briefly, paragraph 8.42 refers to log piles within the site that provide suitable sheltering and hibernating habitat for reptiles. It's my understanding these have all now been removed, so they've been taken away. So just quickly, I'm not asking you to refuse it. I'm just asking if you can strengthen condition 6 to ask for some of the trees that were removed to be replaced. Thank you, members.
Thank you, Councillor Springett. Right, there is a lengthy update on the papers, which I hope members have read, including 2 new proposed conditions. Can I take declarations of lobbying also at this point, please? That's Councillor Harwood, were you lobbied on this? Everyone else seems to have been. Yes, that's everyone. Thank you. Right, Councillor Spooner, as you are one of the other ward members for Bearsted, you get the pleasure of starting.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start off by saying I have no problem with the replacement dwelling. I think that's perfectly acceptable. I also do not have a problem with the widened access. Okay, it's bigger than it really needs to be, but it is replacing 2 existing access points. And I think in highway terms, we haven't had any objections from our highway colleagues. My main concern, as evidenced by one of the residents, is the tree loss and the excessive amount of environmental vandalism, which is the only way I can describe it, which has taken place on the site, going south-west from where the replacement joining is located. If you look at the map that's on the order papers, there is a whole swathe of trees which has been taken out. Looking at this strategically, Bearsted is as beautiful as it is because it is surrounded by woodlands and it is a well-treed urban area. There are lots of trees, and any loss of any tree, I think, is to be regretted. In this particular case, there has been sort of wanton destruction of very important landscape areas which are designated as a special landscape area in the local plan and as a local landscape area of local landscape value, LLV, in the draft local plan. So the protection of the landscape is so important. What I would ask is that condition 6 be extended to cover the entire application site. I don't see why we cannot define the planning unit as the entire application site as identified on the plan that accompanies the application. As one of the speakers has earlier said, this all used to be private garden land at one time. I think we can still argue that is within the planning unit, and I think that the council should be well within its rights to ask for replanting within the wooded area to the southeast of the application site. Another issue which I think the council could address, bearing in mind the location of this site within an SLA and an LLV, is to consider the possibility perhaps of a Forestry Commission woodland management scheme. I mean, this allows trees to be grant aided or tree planting to be grant aided. Whether or not this site would fulfil the criteria the Forestry Commission has, I don't know. But it's something I think should be pursued, and I think the council should do all in its power to replace as many of those felled trees as possible in order to perpetuate that woodland. I think that's all I need to say for the time being. Thank you.
As is the nub of the issue, I will ask Mr Chapman to come back on that, and presumably also, as it's been raised, the issue of whether we should be looking at replacing some of the log piles as well.
Would you like to come back on that now? Okay. In terms of condition 6, I've been listening to what has been said. I think we can bolster that up by adding the phrase on the first full sentence on the top of page 28, where it says a landscaping scheme shall specifically address the need to provide replacement trees for those proposed to be removed, to add to that, and that have been removed, so that we cover those that have already gone. The log piles that would be removed should be replaced. Basically.
Yeah, because obviously they were referred to as a value and they've gone, so we need to do something about that.
I mean, it is in effect covered by the biodiversity condition, but we can be explicit.
I think we should.
Okay. If you'd like me to come back on the woodland management point, I think it would be, frankly, overly onerous for us to include that as a planning requirement, but I would suggest that if members are minded, that could be taken forward as a separate action by officers.
Yeah, I think it's something you should explore with the applicant to see whether that's something that could be done. But as you're right, it would probably be excessive to put it in the actual condition. Councillor Burton, you did indicate well.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I think I perhaps rather jumped the gun. My initial point, or question actually, was going to be on the access, but in light of evidence that has come forward since I put my hand up, it's probably a moot point now. The other thing that I was going to raise, as has been well established so far, was the concerns over trees that have disappeared thus far. I personally think we've reached quite a good conclusion point on that in terms of replacement of previously demolished trees. And in light of that, if the ward members don't mind, I think we ought to move towards granting the application, including the conditions suggested by Mr. Chapman.
Yeah, just a moment. A legal officer wants to come in very briefly.
Reasonably brief. Yeah. Just the issue with the trees and the management. Could we consider perhaps maybe a provision for a landscape management plan to deal with the management of the trees, as opposed to going down the route of the woodland? This woodland management scheme. So rather have a landscape management plan to deal with that.
I mean, a management plan could be put in, and one of the ways that could be delivered would be that conversation. It would only be one of the options to deliver it, but it could be a conversation that still happened. But putting that condition in would give it, would make sure that if that didn't happen, there was still a structure in place. So if members are okay with correcting that.
I would like to see that as a fallback position. I mean, let's go in as hard as we possibly can, and we'll see.
Well, putting the management plan in doesn't preclude doing it that way. It's simply a way of delivering a management plan.
Alternatively, maybe delegate to the officer. My concern is if you put in a condition dealing with landscape management plan, then that is what must go ahead, as opposed to exploring other options as well. So either you've got to say, I will delegate to the officer to consider the best option to deliver landscape management, whether that be through the woodland management scheme or through a landscape management plan condition. It gives flexibility to the officers.
I think, to be honest, the planning officers don't have a problem with changing it to a landscape management scheme to be included, because there are different ways of doing that. Woodland management scheme and the Forestry Commission's a way of doing it. It does not contradict it. But it does mean that that wasn't achievable, we could do it another way. So, thank you very much, Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm happy for it to be delegated to the officer, but I wanted to have reassurance that the planting will specifically say the types of tree. I mean, potentially they could just put some whips in there, and they could fail after 6 months and say they've actually they did try to adhere to that condition. So I think we need to say robustly, sort of, if they fail and what's the time frame, then they will need to be replaced, and be very tight on that point, because we've had some issues with trees in the past. But subject to the points mentioned and raised, I'm happy to propose that we take the recommendation on the paper.
Right, and just to make absolutely sure we've got everything, we will delegate that condition to the officers in consultation with the members, local members, to get the wording exactly right. Okay? Condition 6 to be delegated to the officers in consultation with the local ward members to get the wording correct. Do you wish to be consulted as well, Councillor Harwood? Thank you. Right. On that basis, can we proceed? Councillor Mumford.
Yeah, just so I know exactly what I'm voting on, the condition that we've amended includes the area that Councillor Spooner was indicating, that to the southeast, everything inside the red-lined area, I assume. And have we specified semi-mature trees and not twigs?
We certainly could do that as part of the proposals, a worked-up scheme, yes.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Semi-mature trees and not twigs to go in. I think we're all in agreement with that point. Councillor Harwood, anything else before we move on?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I know we're talking about condition 6 and the way we change it. When I originally saw it, I looked at the line which talks about and a 5-year management plan, and I thought, why are we not saying a landscape management plan, because we use them in application after application. But it may be worthwhile covering the point raised by the ward councillors by placing in brackets behind in landscape management plan something like encompassing the maintenance of well-structured woodland within the site, because I think we need to be prescriptive to say that the woodland is a key issue. And actually, you know, that woodland was a little bit dark and dense, and I know it looks fairly dramatic, but opening up that woodland and creating clearings, it will be a better structured wood in a few years, as long as the wood stays there and isn't grubbed up for phase 2 of the housing development. So I think that's the critical point here, in that we need that longer term management. We've got in square brackets a 5-year management plan. Usually with landscape management plans, we don't set, we set 5 years for replacement of trees and shrubs that die and so on, but we usually have a longer term landscape management plan. And I wonder if that 5 years actually works. The other point is retention of cordwood from tree works is fairly routine, and that could probably go in where we're talking about providing replacement trees. We can just put and retention of cordwood piles, so we're actually stipulating it within the landscaping condition. A little bit further down, it talks about guelder rose. I think that's meant to be guelder rose, and yeah, so the I should be an E, just to get that right. And just on the point on the beech tree, I understand the issues, and it's been kind of badly pollarded in a way that are being talked about, but it is very close to the proposed new units, and actually beech trees, funnily enough, support a greater biodiversity and biomass than when they're dead, than when they're alive. So as long as we retain the cordwood in the site, and as part of that woodland scheme, perhaps we plant up some of these bigger woodland trees, the kind of beeches and the oaks and so on. I think we are getting there to retaining what is a very important site on the edge of urban Bearsted, overlooking the Lem Valley.
Yes, my understanding is that the tree on the screen now, I think known either as T3 or T8, depending on whose list you look at, is the tree in question. My understanding is the applicant is amenable to that being retained. My suggestion is we include the retention of that as part of the overall landscaping wording we've just been discussing. And as I spoke to the landscape officer earlier this evening, and he said it's been its crown has been severely damaged. It could survive 20, 30 years, or it couldn't. In the sense, keeping it there as it is, and let's see how nature takes its course.
Thank you very much. There's a very full and, I think, very useful discussion. Members, the motion is to approve the recommendation with the urgent update, subject to condition 6 being delegated to officers in consultation with the ward members and Councillor Harwood to secure the exact and most beneficial wording.
We will circulate
okay.
wording for their approval.
Yep. Got that? All those in favour? Yes.
Who seconded it?
I did. But Mr. Spooner was very close behind. That's everyone. Thank you. No votes against, obviously, no abstentions. Thank you, members. We look forward to working with you, Mr. Bedford, to bring forward a very good scheme. Right, move to item 11 on page 36. Land adjacent to the Mews. I think we must conclude that Councillor Daly is not likely to join us. Calling on the officers to introduce the report.
Thank you, Chair. Right, just run through a few photos. It's an application for a two-bedroom bungalow at a site adjacent to the Mews in Buckland Lane, Maidstone. Here's some photos of the site from the entrance here. It's a bit of history about the site. It's got a lawful development certificate for the parking of a lorry, so I think the officer describes it as loosely brownfield. There's another photo, and then looking back, it's to the other side of the railway bridge, sort of beyond the settlement boundary for the urban area of Maidstone. It's a long, narrow site which leads back from the road, and you can see the location plan here, where you've got the urban area of Maidstone to the west, and the site beyond the railway line to the east, where the character becomes more semi-rural, more spacious properties within larger plots. Further to the east, there's a number of listed buildings, although this is well screened from the development site. The design itself is traditional, simple in style, low ridge height, and provides two-bedroom floor space. So essentially the issues are the site lies beyond the development boundary in the 2000 plan and the emerging plan as well, which runs along the railway line. And the main issue is the impact on the character of the area and visual impact. The officer's view, whilst it's a brownfield, well, loosely brownfield site because of the LDC decision, the area is characterised by some more spacious properties, and it's got a semi-rural feel, which is, includes the listed cluster of properties to the east. And the provision of a bungalow on a very narrow plot, which would sort of have little spaces between boundaries, would look out of character with that context. So it's considered it could cause harm to the character of the countryside and the area in which it's located. So the officer recommendation is that it's refused for the impact on such character as set out in the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wise, for the applicant.
Thank you, Chairman. The applicant first asked members to note that this application has the support of local residents, and also that a positive approach was received during pre-application discussions initially. In essence, the planning application proposes the replacement of a lawful HGV parking use with a small single-storey dwelling featuring a traditional design and construction materials. And the applicant submits that this would result in a clear betterment in terms of highway movement, in terms of improvements to local amenities, that's residential and visual. And as such, the application could actually be supported by the council under the provisions of the draft local plan policy DM4, which is sympathetic towards redevelopments of sites where there would be environmental benefits and improvements. The officer's report doesn't fully detail all of the supporting comments made by local residents, and they are naturally quite fearful that any future owners of this site with the HGV use could operate the use far more intensively and in a much less neighbourly fashion than the applicant, who has got local ties and was a previous owner and occupant of a nearby house, which is why it was kept quite a low-key use recently. It's noted that the officer consideration was based very much upon recent inspections, which revealed no significant HGV activities. However, that approach ignores the fact that HGVs can lawfully operate from the site 24 hours a day, with no planning restrictions in place governing the size or the type of HGV vehicle, the site's operating hours, the extent of ancillary maintenance and repairs, etc. And this is very important because actually under planning law the council must consider the proposals against the activities that could lawfully take place rather than what they saw on the site on one particular day or has happened very recently. Any new operators would almost certainly use the site more intensively, and lorries could obviously therefore leave the site mornings, late at night, come and go throughout the day, and obviously that's likely to cause noise, vibration and fumes. And these are considerations that the council needs to take into account. This application therefore provides a chance to remove the commercial HGV parking use for the land, and that's not just for the benefit of residents but also the fact that next door is a nationally important Grade 2 listed building called Little Buckland Farm, and so it's submitted the setting of that nationally important building will be improved. The other point the applicant wishes to make is that although officers have opposed the application on the basis a new dwelling does not conform with countryside policies, it's also a fact that the lawful HGV parking use is itself a non-conforming use in terms of development policies for the countryside. Moreover, this site lies within a residential enclave and immediately adjacent to the town confines. It's therefore very sustainably located, and it's not particularly open in character, being surrounded by residential properties to the north, south and to the west. In summary, the applicant submits that this proposal will improve the setting of importance of the building and improve the amenities of the area, safeguard the residential amenities of neighbours, and respectfully ask for permission to be granted.
Thank you, Mr Wise. As I said, it appears Councillor Daly will not be joining us. Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, members. In my capacity as local ward councillor, I would like to speak against this application. I therefore agree with the officer's recommendation that this application should be refused. As you will see in the papers, there have been multiple applications in the past to build a house on this site, and they have all been refused. Before I go on to talk directly about the application, I would like to give some context to the historic significance of this site. As far as I'm aware, the area surrounding the site in question is in one of the oldest parts of Maidstone. In fact, I believe a neighbouring property is one of the oldest domestic buildings in the Maidstone area, dating back to at least the 14th century. This area was also previously used as part of a farm with links traced back to the Roman period. Whilst I agree with the officer that the design of the proposed dwelling is not in itself considered unacceptable, I am concerned about the size of the plot that the application is proposed on. Due to the narrow width of the site, any property built here would be very cramped, making it out of character with all the other properties in this part of Buckland Lane. All the properties here are large, open, spacious plots, and I believe that although this dwelling has been designed for the site, the plot itself is not in keeping and would stand out, especially since it is one of the first properties you see when entering this part of Buckland Lane. Likewise, whilst I accept that there is a need for housing in Maidstone, I do not see how this one individual bungalow will have any impact on helping us fulfil our housing criteria, or housing requirements, as has been suggested in the past. Furthermore, both this site and the one directly next to it are an open space for wildlife in the semi-rural part of Maidstone. I fear that this loss of space will hinder the local wildlife and negatively impact the biodiversity of Buckland Lane. Both the house opposite and the house next door to this application are converted agricultural buildings linked to the farm that used to operate here. If the original purpose of this area was farming, is it not right that we retain this history by leaving this place as natural land to serve a similar purpose to that which it was originally used? Members, I have heard people describe this area in Buckland Lane as a secret oasis, and I am inclined to agree. It is lovely to walk under the bridge in Buckland Lane and find yourself in such a calm and peaceful place, with so many historical connections. So members, whilst I don't believe in living in the past, I do believe that there is something to be said for allowing this secret oasis to continue to be just that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Harding. Right, I don't think there are any urgent updates on this particular application. Are there any declarations of lobbying? I have to declare I've been lobbied on both sides of this application, which is why it ended up at committee, because I had ward members for different wards, because he's close to the boundary of two wards, saying different things, and members of the public saying different things. So that's why this application is before you this evening, because there were divisions of opinion, shall we say, amongst both councillors and members of the public, and I felt it appropriate that they should be aired here. Councillor Harwood, I saw you indicating.
Thank you. Yeah, it is now. Right, I think this is an application which seems innocuous, but you have to actually visit the site. And it's when you proceed down Buckland Lane, you go under the railway viaduct and you go from the most suburban of suburbs into this remarkable survival, the Buckland Farm area, where you've got countryside, sheep by jowl with the town. It's probably seen most, actually, from when you travel on the train to London. I think the concern is if we permit this scheme, as the ward councillor mentioned, it would be a very different form of development. It would be more like what you find on the other side of the railway viaduct. And I do wonder whether there should not be another ground for refusal beyond the wider landscape issue around the narrow width of the site, meaning that there will be a cramped form of development, because I think that would be incongruous and jarring by its very nature. I'm also quite struck by where we talk about the fact that the site sometimes has lorries parked on it, that turns it into previously developed land, because there's a lot of land in Staplehurst and Head Cornerstone has lorries parked on it in the countryside, and if we were to say that suddenly becomes previously developed because it's had a tarmacking lorry parked on it, I think we'd be in trouble. So I do wonder about that point. The other concern I've got, which I think is probably swept up by the proposed reason for refusal, is that if we do introduce residential to this site, it will bring with it lighting, it will bring with it hard surfacing, it will also bring with it, cats, dogs and everything else that goes with it, and I think that will all chip away at this rural feel. So I'm happy to move that we do refuse as per the papers, but I would like the officers to come back as to whether the limitations of the very narrow linear site do potentially have an adverse impact as well, because potentially the design is not okay, as is stated in the officers' report. Thank you.
Personally, I'm going to ask Mr. Chapman to come back. I think that in some ways the grounds for refusal does actually address those issues, although perhaps not in the exact words that you've used, Councillor Harwood. But I'll ask Mr. Chapman to.
Yeah, in my view, the vast majority of the points that have just been raised by Councillor Harwood are covered within the recommendation on page 48 that covers, for example, the cramped nature of the development in comparison to surrounding properties. My own view is that I don't think it's necessary to include reference to domestic accoutrements. I think that's, in summary, what you were getting at. I think that's getting into probably a little bit more detail than I think is necessary, but at the end of the day, it's a professional judgment, and if And if members feel they want to add that to it, I can, there is grounds for doing so.
I'll come back to that in a minute, but Councillor Burton.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd just like to echo a point I made on a previous application without directly referencing that application, is that we set policies and we set boundaries, and this falls outside of them. Thankfully, this time, we are not competing against previous inspectors' decisions. I do feel that if we're going to rest on our principles and on our policies, we should actually see this refused on that basis.
As I don't think there's going to be massive dissent, I'll take Councillor Clark and then I shall proceed.
Chairman, I was just seconding the proposal.
Councillor Mumford, as he didn't wish to speak, do you wish to?
It's just very quickly, in the reasons for refusal, we are quoting DM34. DM34.6, even though it's talking about an extension, if we could actually incorporate that, that is everything that Councillor Harwood said. Sympathetic to...
I think we may need to just check that wording. May I check, whilst that's being done, if it does not relate to domestic accoutrements, do members wish shall we say, domestic paraphernalia, I think is the actual term usually used. Do members wish to incorporate that in the grounds of refusal? Councillor Harwood, did you want to come back on that very briefly?
I think it is the rural feel of the site which is important, and I do wonder, after the third word where it says the proposed development, we could potentially add something like, and the domestic paraphernalia that would accompany it would be detrimental. And then we're going on to talk about, the cramped and the out of keeping and so on. But I do wonder whether we need to add that, because I don't think it is just about a bungalow. It's all the car parking and the lighting and everything that goes with it will change that character. But, if officers feel it will be detrimental, I will withdraw that. But if it could potentially help, I think it is an issue for consideration.
Well, having looked at DM34, section 6, I think that's the wording is different, but I think it isn't any significant change to the recommendation. But thank you for pointing out. In terms of the paraphernalia, Mr.
Yeah, I think DM34 largely covers, DM34.6 largely covers those elements. I'll just read it out so we're clear. Development outside of the settlement boundary will be permitted if it meets the following. Where extension or alteration of existing building is proposed, it will be of a scale which relates sympathetically to the existing building in the rural area, respect local building styles and materials, have no significant adverse impact on the form, appearance or setting of the building, and would respect the architectural and historical integrity of any adjoining building or group of buildings of which it forms part. The point there being that the proposal is not considered, if the committee go that way, to be of an appropriate scale and would have a significant adverse impact. That's the reference to DM34 is in the reason for refusal as it stands. If members, as I've mentioned earlier, if members feel minded to, we could add to the wording of the recommendation that the proposed development and associated domestic accoutrements would be detrimental to the character and visual amenities of the area. I have no professional problem with that additional wording being included if members so wish.
On that basis, I think then, Councillor Harwood, that I will see if there's a seconder for your proposal. Councillor Mumford, thank you. Sorry, Councillor Clark, but that was a slightly different proposal, so I did take a new seconder. Apologies for that.
Sorry, Chair. Can I just get to...
Yeah, one moment. Yes, thank you. The legal officer would just like, for his own benefit and some of ours probably, to have the full recommendation.
Okay. So the recommendation as amended would read, the proposed development and associated domestic accoutrements would be detrimental to the character and visual amenities of the area, representing an undesirable consolidation of an extension to an area of built development in the rural area outside the defined urban boundary, and due to the cramped nature of development in comparison to the surrounding properties would be out of character with the character and appearance of this small rural enclave located close to the urban area of Maidstone, contrary to... Do you want me to continue?
No.
Yeah, it's as per. Sorry,
The rest of it.
And sorry, Chair, Tim, you're satisfied that that's defensible, yeah?
Right, thank you, members. That's been clarified. Thank you for your contributions. All those in favour of the recommendation has been moved and seconded. Well, we are doing well tonight. That's unanimous again. I'm not sure. I wonder whether that will continue. Right, item 12, page 50. We go south to the ever-popular, in planning terms, village of Staplehurst. Page 12, item 12, page 50. The officer would care to introduce the report.
Right, this is site land south of, adjacent to South Cottage in the High Street in Staplehurst. It's an application for temporary security fencing, which... there's a site area there, and the location of the fence here, located in red. And essentially, you can see the Harris fencing in between the hedge and the cottage. Here it is with its,
It's lovely.
I think it's pink colours are popular. And essentially, that's the proposal. The applicant has put this fencing up as a security measure for trespass. Obviously, the council are recommending it for approval, but only on the basis for a temporary period of 12 months, which will allow something to be done with the site in the meantime. But there's I think, a varied condition in the update about the removal of the piece of fencing that turns into the site. So essentially, that's the proposal. So.
Thank you very much. That's a thing of beauty. Councillor Buller, Staplehurst Parish Council, please.
The Parish Council wishes to see this application refused because the fencing is detrimental to the conservation area and to adjacent listed buildings. This fencing has been erected without permission and no reason was given for its installation or for the previous clearance of the site. Photos sent in by a local resident show clearly how attractive this area was before the recent works, and that the original fence, was abutting the highway. This in stark contrast to how the site looks now. Please consider the before and after scenes. PW4 of our Maid Neighbourhood Plan states that new developments must have regard to the historic environment and the heritage that is an integral part of the landscape. We also wish to see the water tank and its accumulated clutter moved to a less obtrusive position, or better still, removed. If this site is to be enclosed, then a replacement hedge or a fence of a more traditional design would be in keeping with this area. Staplehurst Parish Council further considers that the fence has a seriously adverse effect on the street scene in the Staplehurst Conservation Area and on the setting of the listed buildings, the importance of which was emphasised by the Planning Inspector's recent report when he dismissed the appeal against refusal of planning permission for a pair of semi-detached houses on this land. The Parish Council therefore recommends that the temporary security fencing be replaced as soon as possible by a boundary treatment which is in keeping with this area and with the existing boundary fences on the other sides of the site. Planning application 15/507585 was for a replacement side fence next door. In this case, the officer's report stressed the importance of appropriate design and colour. There needs to be a consistent approach to adjacent sites. The officer's report for this application does agree this fencing is not suitable on a permanent basis because of its situation in such a sensitive area. It does not make sense to grant temporary permission for a year. It's already been blighting the area for many months. No. Refuse this application and give the applicant a short time frame to remove this fencing and submit a new application. We are pleased that the Inspector for the Emerging Local Plan wishes to strengthen the protection of the historic environment in the borough by introducing a new strategic policy, SP18, which states that the characteristics, distinctiveness, diversity and quality of heritage assets will be protected and, where possible, enhanced. Staplehurst is rightly proud of its conservation area, and the High Street contains many listed buildings. Nothing should spoil this area. I hope the Planning Committee will support the Parish Council and our residents and refuse this application. Thank you.
Councillor Perry, who's flown back from Vienna specifically to speak to this.
Chairman, you talked about a thing of beauty. I hope you weren't casting aspersions about my trousers, Minister. I was really surprised that this application has been recommended for approval, and I strongly support the Parish Council's recommendation for refusal. The reason for approval appears to be that the fencing would cause less than substantial harm and only be temporary. I believe this is to be a totally wrong conclusion. This is a retrospective application. This fencing has already been up for some time, and we have tried to get MBC to take enforcement action. And this planning application seems to be no more than a device to avoid enforcement action being taken. And in addition, we all know what temporary means. What we have here is crude wire fencing with pink blotches all over it, the colour of which you can actually see from my trousers, situated between listed buildings right in the centre of our village conservation area. Page 55 of the report sums up all the reasons why this application should be refused. I will highlight policy DM1, which includes criteria to respond positively to and, where possible, enhance the local natural nature or historic character of the area and provide a quality design which responds to areas of heritage townscape. Do you honestly think that pink wire fencing achieves this? This also had a direct link to policy PW4, the adopted Staplehurst Neighbourhood Plan, which is identified in paragraph 6.18 of the report. And this states, new developments in Staplehurst must have regard to the historic environment and the heritage that is an integral part of the landscape. But yet again appears to have been totally ignored, despite it being adopted by this very same council. Paragraph 6.23 states that the Conservation Officer is satisfied that the visual impact is minimal. Words fail me. If you care to look out of that window over there, onto the High Street, you'll see a premises called Specsavers. I would respectfully suggest that this visit is urgently needed. And let's face it, this would not be the first time that this committee has gone against the views of a conservation officer. The argument that a security fence is required and therefore subsequent benefit outweighs the harm is a complete canard. A security fence of this nature is not needed in what is just an open area. A perfectly acceptable hedge has been grubbed up and we've been left with an eyesore. If you lived in a listing building in a conservation area, would you find this acceptable? Please support the residents of Staplehurst, its parish council and its neighbourhood plan, which you have all adopted, and please refuse this application.
Thank you, Councillor Perry. And there I was thinking you were coming along to ask for this fence to be listed as an historic monument. But perhaps it's the wrong colour. Perhaps UKIP purple might have blended in more with the background. Sorry, I'm being flippant there. Right, there is an urgent update. And can I take declarations of lobbying from anyone? I've been lobbied as well. Anyone else?
Who hasn't been lobbied?
Councillor Butler, Councillor Cox.
You guys have been lobbied. Who hasn't been lobbied? Sorry. Councillor Cox.
Right. Councillor Clark, I believe you indicated, and as we don't have any ward members here.
Thank you, Chairman. I was looking for some clarity from officers. My gut feeling is that this is temporary fencing, and it's going to be difficult for us to actually refuse it on the fact that it should likely be permitted development. But carrying on along that path, I do wonder why this came forward as an actual planning application. Is it because of the conservation area aspect? And if we follow on from that, if we give it permission, will that not then allow this to be renewed and renewed and renewed because it's temporary fencing? I'm concerned about it, and I would like a little bit more detail about where we've got to this point, and what we're letting ourselves in for if we do allow it to go ahead.
A very cogent question, but I will take Councillor Powell first before I bring the officers back, just in case.
Yeah, it was really following on from Councillor Clark, Mr. Chairman. But I just picked up on a few words. Firstly, there was visual impact, conservation, the fact that it was temporary and it was actually put up without any permissions at all. I haven't come across retrospective on wire fencing before, but I'm sure it has been done. But it actually looks blimmin' horrible. When you actually know that stretch of road in the area, that does absolutely nothing at all for the area. And I would like to have seen the applicant actually come and talk to the council in the first instance rather than just put it up. One final word was enhance. I can't really see how this enhances anything. So it's just really to follow on from Councillor Clark and the question that he's asked, but I'm afraid I'll be voting against this tonight.
Yeah, so I think, Mr. Chapman, we probably do need some clarification as to where we exactly stand, because members, sorry, Mr. Ashley, well, you know, we will conclude that if it was a security issue, they could have just left the hedge there. Why this? So can we have some clarification on those points? Sorry, I had the wrong officer.
Yeah, your point on permitted development, because it's adjacent to a highway, it would need consent because of the height. I understand that the previous hedge and fence was removed. The trees, according to the report, were in poor condition, and that's the rationale why that the original boundary treatment was removed. In terms of the precedent about whether that would allow continual renewals after the temporary period, guidance does say that there has to be special circumstances in terms of allowing continued temporary consent. So I think in this case we've allowed it for security for a temporary period whilst acknowledging the harm that takes place, but on the basis it's temporary, the recommendation is that the approval is justified because of the temporary period.
Can you address the point of how we actually ensure that it is a temporary period and we don't actually get lumbered with it? Because you know what temporary can often mean in planning terms.
I think the point I'd make on that is we need to judge this application on its merits, and it's an application for a temporary period of 12 months. We can add an informative regarding the fact that this is a temporary consent and that consideration of a longer period of retention is not something we would welcome. I'm sure we can come up with a better phrase than that, but to basically say it should be removed after 12 months was that effect, on the basis of its not being appropriate for the area on a long-term basis. Well, that would be my suggestion.
Thank you very much. That's interesting. Councillor Mumford, please.
The first thing that I see is this type of fencing is not designed for what it's being used for. It's not a security fence. It is something, it's a site fence that builders work behind, and it's to keep the public safe. That's why we have it. There's no mention of the Conservation Management Plan. I don't know if anyone's looked at that. But if we are talking about temporary, and we do take the officer's recommendation, is there a way we can reduce the time, cut it in half, or probably say 2 months?
I'll come back to these questions when we got a reasonable number of them. Councillor Butler.
Thank you, Chairman. Would it be acceptable if it had been a different colour? And if we did refuse this application, if we did refuse the application, would enforcement follow?
I think it's a separate question. I think that we'll come back to Councillor Clark. I'll add you to the list. Right, I will take Councillor Round next.
To some extent, thank you, Chair. Councillor Butler has actually asked the point I wanted to make anyway, but history tells me that temporary is always a mess, and history also tells me that why should it have been there in the first place? It should have been enforced. It's basically the same point. It should have been enforced, it shouldn't even be permanent, so therefore it shouldn't even be temporary.
Well, I suppose, as has been said earlier, often the defensive measure against enforcement is to put a planning application in. Of course, while that's being dealt with, it is a bit difficult to enforce it. We've had a number of questions, so I'm going to take those now.
In terms of the points raised, I mean, the recommendation is for a 12-month approval. If members feel that that is excessive, there is the option to limit it further. I think the point I would make about it being a retrospective application is we still have to treat it on its own merits. There is a process to go through, and obviously that's why we're here this evening. I understand there has been some contact with the authority in terms of its enforcement powers. The application refers to an enforcement officer as being the first point of contact that the applicants had on this matter. I'm not aware of any ongoing enforcement on this case, but certainly we can add an informative that can be examined at the expiry of the consent. So I hope that's covered all the points, but please come back to me if there's anything I've missed.
Well, the immediate question, before I take anyone else, is what periods of time are available as options for a shorter period of temporary consent? 2 months might be a little short, but what options do we have in that respect?
If you're asking my opinion, I'd suggest 6 months.
Thank you. It's important to know what the options are. Councillor Spooner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sure the officers will correct me if I'm wrong, but we should surely be looking at something here which either maintains or enhances the character of the conservation area. It is a conservation area. There's listed buildings either side. There is a powerful argument that the actual site is actually within the curtilage of a listed building. Therefore, we should be applying very stringent policies and very stringent criteria to what goes there. There's also a phrase in the planning world about there's nothing so permanent as a temporary permission. And I do wonder if this will drag on and drag on. I would like ideally to see the application refused. I think the applicant should come forward with a far better screening proposal and to make his site secure. If that is not agreed by the committee, then perhaps we could consider a shorter period of time, and the officer has just said 6 months, but we also have to look at what can actually be achieved in that 6 months. You know, is the landowner going to sell the site? Is he going to put in a fresh application? He's not going to have time to do anything like that at all. So I would far rather see the application refused and for him to come back with a better scheme that would fit in with the conservation area.
Are you proposing that, Councillor Spooner?
I would do, yes.
Thank you. Is that seconded? Councillor Powell, you were first. Narrowly. Did you want to speak to that again, Councillor Powell, as you seconded it?
Oh, sorry.
No, I think almost what I said earlier on was almost a summary to what Councillor Spooner has just said, so I'm more than happy to second it.
Right, I think you did sort of address the reasons in your speech, but if you could actually... I think you were trying to say something about because of the sensitive location within the curtilage of a listed building, this application fails to meet the policy criteria to maintain and enhance the conservation area in the setting of a listed building or something.
Yes.
Right. We'll put the policy numbers in, but that's the nub of the issue. The officer said that was sufficient. Right, I will take the three speakers have indicated already, if they have anything to add. Councillor Cox.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just have one question. Why do they need to have a security fencing? Are they actually proposing something to be built behind it? And obviously, it's been called in by the parish council. The amount of money it's taken to bring that here, I'm sure possibly could have been used to actually sort something out as a proper boundary fencing, maybe of a white picket fence, or something becoming there, not pink. If it's going to be a building plot, then we've just had a listed building at the bottom of Lower Stone Street that's just been covered with blue and white hoarding with lights all round it. But it's at the time when they're going to actually do the building. If this is protecting the public from the land, or vice versa, then it's justified to have a fence there. But if it isn't, but I've read through it again just sitting here, I can't see why it was put there. Do we know why?
Well, but there's no application in at the moment. If there were, there might be grounds for a temporary application. We might be in a different ball game, but there isn't anything at the moment at all. So we're in the dark on that, and as the applicant hasn't chosen to come this evening to tell us, we're still in the dark. Councillor Burton and then Councillor Clark, and we will wind up.
Thank you, Chairman. Really, my first question is null now because I find myself in a position of probably wanting to support the very well-worded recommendation, as you put it. But should that fail, I would like to know a little bit on where we stand in terms of conditioning or informativizing. Yeah, thank you. The type of fencing should this be granted? Because actually we have an application in front of us that is to do with fencing, but surely we could actually condition something that A is actually secure, and B is far less offensive to those who walk past it. But you know, I don't really need that answer unless we get to that stage, because I think we've got a vote coming anyway.
Yeah, sorry. Looking at the conditions here, and you'll notice from the presentation you have a diagram, very illuminating diagram of the fencing there. So my understanding is that's what you're being asked to consider, and that's what you would approve if you decided to this evening, minus the pink paint, which is referred to
That's the best bit.
under condition 3 on page 58. So, in a sense, if you would like different fencing, then that's frankly a different matter. What you have in front of you is this proposal, well, this retrospective proposal for this fencing. So you need to make a decision on that basis, not on a change to it, if that makes sense.
Thank you. I think that answers that question.
I was just going to say, so it wouldn't constitute a condition regarding change of material, for example.
I wish. No, unfortunately, given the nature of the type of application, if only we could do it by a change of condition from the material, but I'll just check whether Mr. Chapman wrote it down, otherwise I'll give it to you again. Right. No, I don't need an adjournment. I can. Right. By. Yep. No, well, in a minute, yes. Right. The application, by virtue of its sensitive location within the curtilage of a listed building.
I just wanted to butt in then because I don't think I would consider the site to be within the Kirchhoff listed building. I think it's adjoining listed building. It's debatable whether it's in the curtilage, and if the committee want to refuse, I would suggest adjoining a listed building rather than within the curtilage. It's a minor point, but I think it's significant.
I think that is an important point. Okay, I did say adjoining originally, actually. Adjoining a listed building and within the conservation area. Yeah, and within the conservation area. Should be refused as it fails to maintain and enhance the setting of the listed building and the overall character and quality of the conservation area. That could probably Sorry, we've improved that slightly.
Okay.
Gone back to what I said originally.
The application is refused on the basis of significant adverse visual impact on the conservation area and adjoining listed buildings, contrary to, and then add the relevant policies.
Okay. Yeah, after a bit of thought, we've got there. Are there any state-wise neighbourhood plan policies that apply? We're just checking the relevant neighbourhood plan policy as well.
It's in the report. It's in the report.
We might add that.
PW4 on page 56 is the relevant neighbourhood plan policy, which could be used to justify the wording I just read out.
And Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm concerned that we're using... I'm concerned that a planning application and planning permission for this is a bit of a blunt instrument. I'm even more concerned that refusing it is an even blunter instrument, and I'm worried about this application, which could be considered to be permitted under permitted development, could go all the way up to appeal. It gets in front of an inspector, and an inspector takes away the limitation on time, and then they end up leaving it there for the next 10 years. I'm really concerned about that. Now, given that all we're essentially giving this applicant, and let's think about the spirit of collaboration, we're only giving them the ability to have this fencing there for 6 months, but we're using the planning application and potentially going all the way to appeals in order to give this person 6 months. I would like to propose an amendment, which is that we defer this application as an application and have our enforcement team and officers talk to the applicant, potentially we could give a strong steer as the planning committee to enforcement if enforcement feel that they have to enforce, so the only way of moving forward is for the applicant to put a planning application. I think we should give a very strong steer to the enforcement team that we would be willing to allow this to go for 6 months, but beyond that it would be an enforcement issue. He will get his 6 months by that. If he genuinely only wants a period of time to sort this out, then I think that we would be safer to defer and to try a little bit of collaboration before we... If it comes back as a planning application, then by all means we can try this. But I just feel this is a slippery slide, and I can see that fence being there in 10 years' time.
I think we need to be clear, it isn't permitted development.
But a government inspector would have to review his thoughts on that.
It is not permitted development because it is over the height for a fence in a location such as this. So let's be clear about that. It isn't permitted development. In terms of whether, well, we can always defer to talk to an applicant, but how willing this applicant is to engage, well, who knows? We could lose, but you know, I'm not often incautious. Sometimes, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I really think this is a hideous, inappropriate fence, and it should be refused at this point. Maybe I'm wrong, but I can't vote for this. Well, it hasn't. Yeah, I will take that point. Don't worry. I was just going to ask whether Councillor Cox's motion was seconded. Sorry, Councillor Clark's motion was seconded. Apologies, Martin. You can always ask a question.
Thank you, Chairman. Like Councillor Clark, I am a little bit concerned about the reasonableness of Maidstone's position on this application, and I understand all the local concerns, I understand everything else, but it is not a secure fence. I mean, it is a security fence which you can push over. So I'm just wondering whether, if we have up our sleeves the threat of refusing this and causing all sorts of problems, a deferral for one cycle so that we can go to them and say, put a chestnut spile fence along that site frontage, and we won't, whether that will achieve the security issue at a cheap cost and it will not have the adverse impact upon the site. Because, like Councillor Clark, in the current climate, I just think it will probably take months before there's an appeal and they move anything. And there might be a reasonable way to overcome this, because the NPPF and other planning guidance and advice says we should talk to applicants and see if there is a negotiated settlement. And what we want is a chestnut spar fence or something similar. I understand the parish have tried various, softly approach, but now it's backed up by this committee looking minded to refuse. So I would like the officer's view on whether potentially a negotiated way forward might be more fruitful, and it would only be a deferral for one cycle.
Okay, thank you, Chair. As I think I mentioned earlier, the application was made following contact between the applicant and our enforcement team, because one of the enforcement officers is named within the pre-application advice section of the application form. I don't have any details regarding that dialogue. The application obviously is in front of you with a recommendation for a temporary permission. If the committee is minded to refuse, then we can put an informative on that regarding the opportunity for the applicant to establish a dialogue on what is an acceptable solution. The deferral would allow an opportunity for that dialogue to take place prior to the next cycle, subject to availability of the various parties. We can do either, in effect. Obviously, I would, just like to draw your attention to the fact the recommendation is there for approval, and we were talking about a more restrictive time period. So that, in a sense, there are three options, I think, open to members. One is to approve perhaps with a shorter time period and a suitable informative. One is to defer for one cycle for the dialogue we've just been discussing, and one is to refuse perhaps with a similar informative to suggest such a dialogue. I'm not sure how much further I can go in terms of guiding members on those three options.
Yeah, I would like to draw this to a conclusion, but Councillor Powell.
Yeah, just one point, Mr. Chairman. I think we've already made a decision that we was going to go to the vote on this. I think enforcement have already been forced into talking to this applicant before because he didn't do things the right way. Let's go ahead, do the vote. If the vote goes the way that I hope it goes, and then let the applicant come back to us with a proper proposal. Thank you.
I would take it, though, that members who are so minded would like us to actually draw the applicant's attention to the option to pursue an alternative, more acceptable proposal. Councillor Burton.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'll formally propose that informative as an amendment to the...
It's not technically an informative,
Oh.
because you can only put one of those on
Right.
an approval,
So-
but it's more of a file note. But, Councillor Spooner.
Just very quickly, there is no reason why negotiations with the applicant can't take place, even though the application has been refused. But by refusing it, at least the Borough Council is drawing a line in the sand, and it's a clear message to the owner as to what the Borough Council is prepared to accept and not prepared to accept.
Well, rightly or wrongly, I sense there's a fairly strong view. So I am going to put it to the vote, but obviously we take the amendment first, which is... Yes, it is. Yeah, well, that's a good point. Councillor Harwood actually raised... yes, I thought you had seconded, but technically... OK, right. It has been now proposed and seconded. We'll put that to the vote. That is in favour of deferring the issue for one cycle only, stress one cycle only, and making it quite plain to the applicant that we would be minded to move, likely to move to refusal. Obviously, you can't tempt fate in quite that manner, but... Right, those in favour of that amendment? 3. Those against? That's 9, obviously no abstentions. That falls. The substantive motion for refusal on the grounds that already read out, so I don't propose to have them reread. All those in favour? That's 8. Those against? 1, 2, 3, 4. Right, the substantive motion is passed. That concludes the planning applications for this evening, I believe. We have the item on appeal decisions on the agenda, which is at the back of your agenda, page 16.
I wasn't particularly going to say anything
No,
unless there were any questions.
Right, I don't think there are, but I had to pause for a moment just in case anyone did indicate they haven't. Therefore, we can pass over that. There are no chairman's announcements as such, just simply to say, as we didn't have the opportunity at the beginning of the last meeting because of the obvious need to commemorate rather unfortunate circumstances, both locally and nationally, to welcome Councillor Spooner to this meeting of the committee, very late in the day, but welcome anyway, and Councillor Vizard, and I'm sure we will appreciate your expertise on this committee in the coming year. Obviously, for those of you who don't know, Mr Spooner has quite a record in planning for one way or another in previous employment. So welcome aboard.